There is a very interesting case reported there this week or last week in the media. It involves the heady mix of the Residential Tenancies Board, adverse possession and the Bid X1 property auction. Irish people have a fascination with property, and I've made videos before about Bid X1 auctions, and I've made videos giving some tips about bidding at Bid X1 auctions and online auctions generally, and I've given some tips about buying at such auctions and what you need to be very, very careful about. In this particular case though, it's an interesting, very interesting case from a legal perspective. There's a gentleman living in a house there in Rathfarnham called John O'Gara, and he is living in the house, he claims, for 15 years plus. In other words, in excess of 15 years, he says. He hasn't paid rent for that period of time. And if he hasn't paid rent for that period of time and hasn't acknowledged that he's a tenant, hasn't acknowledged the landlord's title, well then he may be able to claim adverse possession. In other words, he may be able to claim possession of the house and to be entitled to be registered as the owner of the house. Now, this isn't a Mickey Mouse house. This is a house worth perhaps €1 million or thereabouts. So the background to the case is John O'Gara is the gentleman who's living in the house. He says he's living there for 15 years plus in South County Dublin. He's persuaded the High Court to overturn a finding that he was validly served with a lease termination notice. So he was served with a lease termination notice which emanated from the Residential Tenancies Board, but he managed to persuade the High Court that he didn't actually have, there wasn't a valid tenancy in place, and therefore the RTB's notice to quit, etc., the determination essentially wasn't valid, and he's managed to have that overturned. So he argued that there was no evidence allowing the Residential Tenancies Board, that's the RTB, to conclude that he was a tenant at the detached property, which sits on half an acre in Rathfarnham. So Residential Tenancies Board issued a determination and purported to deal with this, given that there was a tenancy registered. But the High Court has recognised that even though a tenancy may be registered with the RTB, that doesn't necessarily follow that there's a valid tenancy in place. He denies the existence of any tenancy, and he's claiming ownership of this house on Ballyboden Road by adverse possession. The background to the case heard that Mr. O'Gara rather, the tenant, or the man in the house rather, not the tenant, he'll say he's not a tenant. He'll say that he's living there rent-free and is entitled to ownership of the house essentially now. He did not participate in the RTB hearing last September because he said that there was no tenancy existed between him and Patrick Fitzgerald. Patrick Fitzgerald purchased this property from a receiver in June 2022. The house was advertised as having an advised minimum value of €1 million, so the house probably made something in that region. Mr. Fitzgerald, that's the man who bought the house from the receiver, he told the RTB the property had been advertised as subject to a tenancy under terms unknown, and there were no viewings prior to the online auction. He said he spoke to the previous owner of the house, who said he let the property to Mr. O'Gara in 2007. So even the previous owner's evidence that he let the property to Mr. O'Gara in 2007 isn't of huge significance, because that tenancy in 2007, if there was one, may only have lasted for 12 months. And if it lasted for 12 months, well then it finished at the end of 2007, say, or 2008. So your man's claim that he's living there rent-free since 2008 or thereabouts would still allow him to claim adverse possession. Mr. Fitzgerald, he said the man was not very clear on the details. He said he believed that the rent was €2,000 a month. He said the man in the house said that the rent was paid monthly for about 12 to 18 months before AIB took over the rent collection, and he and his co-owner had no further involvement. So the bank took over the mortgage, took over the property then, appointed the receiver, and the receiver sold the property. You'll have to forgive that noise there, that was the dishwasher. So I'm a man for all seasons and have various responsibilities, and today I'm on dishwashing duty, so that was the dishwasher finishing up there. Anyway, 2 weeks after purchasing the house, Mr. Fitzgerald sent Mr. O'Gara a demand for rent of €4,500, which was based on the present day rental income for similar properties. He said that he registered the so-called tenancy with the RTB. He said Mr. O'Gara, that's the man in the house, did not pay any rent and has refused to let him access the property. The judge said that Mr. Fitzgerald served Mr. O'Gara with a warning letter in August 2022 and a notice of termination the following month. So a notice of termination was served in September 2022. The RTB Tribunal, the Residential Tenancies Board Tribunal, accepted a notification of rental arrears was valid and accepted that the notice of termination was validly served. It determined that Mr. O'Gara should vacate the property by September 13, 2023. Mr. O'Gara then appealed to the High Court, which on Wednesday found that there was no evidence before the Residential Tenancies Board Tribunal of any tenancy between Mr. O'Gara and Mr. Fitzgerald, and that being the case, the RTB determination for Mr. O'Gara to get out of the house was essentially overturned and invalid and of no effect. The judge noted that a tenancy was registered in 2007 that named Mr. O'Gara and 2 others, and another was registered in 2011 naming Mr. O'Gara. However, it is accepted that RTB registration does not create a tenancy. In the absence of evidence of the existence of any tenancy agreement since 2007, the RTB lacked jurisdiction to deal with the matter and was in error in finding the notice of termination was valid, the judge ruled. He said that Mr. O'Gara's appeal must succeed. He set aside the RTB Tribunal's report and remitted the matter back to the Residential Tenancies Board to consider it afresh. What the Residential Tenancies Board can do now, I'm not really sure, and I'm not really sure what the High Court judge expects the Residential Tenancies Board to do if in fact there's no valid tenancy in existence since 2007 or thereabouts. It'll be interesting to see what way this pans out, but this house is worth probably in the region of €1 million, and you have an adverse possession claim there from Mr. O'Gara, who claims that he's lived there for at least 15 years without paying rent, and if he hasn't paid rent and he's lived there and he has basically claimed now adverse possession, well then his claim might succeed. I have no idea whether it will or not. That will depend later on, I suppose, on the evidence that will end up perhaps at land registry. Maybe it'll come back into court again. Obviously it's going back to the RTB now. But if there's one thing you can gather from this, and it's something that I've harped on about from time to time, a lot of online auctions, especially Bid X1 auctions, are receiver sales, and some of those receiver sales are receiver sales of property where there is a tenant in situ in the property, and it'll be stated in the contract that the property is being sold subject to an occupational interest in the property. And in other words, somebody is there living in the property, and the receiver will say he's there on terms unknown. In other words, the receiver won't know what the story is in terms of rent, whether there was a letting agreement in place, when it started, etc., etc. And taking or buying a property at any of these auctions with a tenant occupying the property on terms unknown is the sort of risk that can go badly pear-shaped, and clearly in this case it's gone pear-shaped. But buying a property, I know 1 or 2 people who have actually bought properties with tenants on terms unknown, etc., and in one case in particular it worked out okay, but it's a risk that I personally wouldn't take because the difficulty in getting tenants out of properties, occupants out of properties, are pretty significant in this country, particularly given the landlord and tenancy legislation, and particularly given the role of the RTB in such disputes. Hope you find this video useful. If you do, I'd appreciate if you give it the thumbs up down below, and you may be interested in subscribing to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.